about in-depth analysis of 5,000 meter training with Stryd. This is kind of a part two. Last week on the show, we talked about comparing 5K time trials. There's a time trial I did here in Boulder, Colorado a couple weeks ago in June, and then a couple weeks later did another 5K time trial follow-up. We covered that last week, and this week we're going to look a little bit more in depth at the training in between, show off some specific workouts, some specific percentages as well. So very excited to take you through that today. First things first, I would like to say if anybody has any questions along the way, if you are watching live, either on our Facebook group or on our YouTube live stream, you can feel free to put the questions or any comments down in the chat boxes on the respective platforms. Producer Kaylee will be sending them along my way to tackle at the end of the show. Other thing, if you are not already subscribed to our YouTube channel, please make sure to check and see if you are subscribed. And then you can also click on the little notification bell to get notified when we do go live for these, in case you want to ask any questions in future webinars. So getting started here, in-depth 5,000 meter training analysis with Stryd. I'm going to set the stage a little bit and then we'll get into some of the specifics. So what we'll cover: 2 5,000 meter time trials on the track, and then specific training analysis in between these results. Number one, I do realize that in some of the past presentations, I kind of jump into things for anybody that might be new or might be first kind of finding out what Stryd is or running with power is. I just wanted to kind of cover the bases and make sure we're all on the same kind of level playing field. So first things first, a benefit of training with power is objective. It doesn't fluctuate due to outside factors like temperature. The newest Stryd release a little bit more than a year ago with the added air resistance lets you understand your environment, gives you a better understanding of the training environment you're running in. You have a detachment from focusing only on time. So when you train by power, the conditions, the terrain that you're running over, it is decoupled from time, so you don't have to focus on hitting, a 4-minute kilometer over and over and over again. The time might vary, but the power output can stay the same. And then another benefit that I'll kind of get into about talking about training with power is focusing on your current ability and your current output. So really excited to touch on a couple of these points as we get through things. So talking about 5K number one, the initial time trial, June 26, 2020, here in Boulder, Colorado, 5,400 feet above sea level, just over 1,600 meters above sea level. Shoes I wore were the Nike Next Percent, the nice pink shoes in that picture there. Temperature of 64 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 degrees Celsius, 63% humidity, and my 5K time was 15:45. You can see on the bottom row here some of the summary metrics that we do have here. So I averaged about 340 watts for this, right at 5,400 feet above sea level, 181 steps per minute on average for my 5K, 161 beats per minute. I will say, if we're talking about heart rate stuff here, this is coming from a optical heart rate sensor on my Garmin 245 that I was using for this. Form power. So the form power is a specific portion of the power that is dedicated towards not moving you forward necessarily. It's your kind of up and down power. Ground contact time, 179 milliseconds on average. Leg spring stiffness, 9.8 kilonewtons per meter. We'll get into that a little bit later on. My vertical oscillation, 8.17 centimeters on average, with my air power 1%. So not a very windy day, not a very gusty day on the track. I did have my training partner, Brian, here sharing some of the lead with me. So I got to sit behind him and draft behind him a little bit. So this is, again, setting the stage. We did do a full kind of dive in and comparison on the 2 different time trials last week. And I'm kind of setting the stage just so we all understand the training that we're going to talk about based on these 2 efforts. And then 5K number 2, this was August 15th, so about 6 weeks of training later. Elevation of 700 feet, about 213 meters above sea level. Wore the same exact shoes. Temperature was a little bit warmer at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius. Humidity was way up there, 91% humidity, and then my time was 15:07. We can see that pretty much everything improved or stayed about the same, and we'll talk about some of the comparisons and talk about the training and how that influenced some stuff here in a little bit. So as always, when I talk about some of the races, I like to highlight some of the strategy and make sure that the variables we're comparing are very, very similar. So in both cases, the strategy was to start with the first kilometer or 2.5 laps on a standard 400-meter track, slightly below my goal. And then the next second, third, and fourth kilometers, so those middle laps, to run at my goal. So I have a goal range based on the Stryd race power calculator, which you can find in your Stryd mobile app, or you can go to stryd.com/power center and you can view the calculator section there. And then run the 5th kilometer slightly above my goal. So give myself the ability to close hard and run really well. And I'll talk about why this strategy is important in the race and how I was able to train this way. And you will see that I train this way and really use this strategy exactly to meet my goals come race day. So again, 5,000 meter comparisons at a pretty big bump in power, cadence right about the same. So the elevation was pretty different, but the cadence overall within 1 step per minute on average. Heart rate about equal, using the same device to capture the heart rate. My form power ratio was much improved. So the form power actually stayed the same. But as I was getting faster, I was using a lot of that excess power. We can see that I averaged 369 watts compared to 339 from the first time trial to the second time trial. And so my form power ratio actually got a lot better. My ground contact time went down slightly, about 4 milliseconds on average. My leg spring stiffness was a little bit lower. That could be due to the fact that I was running a little bit faster, my vertical oscillation a little bit less, and my air power quite a lot more. I didn't necessarily have as many people to pace with for this race, so the air power was a little bit higher. But a cool kind of summary and comparison between these two race efforts. Let's talk about planning training now. So for this training block based on my first 5K, I had a Stryd auto-calculated critical power of 329 watts, which in my profile, that's 5.18 watts per kilogram. The focus was one threshold or one fartlek workout. A threshold run might be something like a continuous effort right around that critical power, maybe a little bit lower, ending a little bit higher. A fartlek run in this context specifically means time-based intervals. And so anytime you see me use the word fartlek, in this case, it does mean a specific set of intervals with a time where you're running on or you're running hard, and then a recovery portion where it's deemed the off period or the recovery period. 1 day of track work typically per week, 1 long run, and then 2 days of strides. And so we'll talk about some of the variety in this training, and I'll get in specifics about how the training is planned and then how it's executed and how it's reflected on as well. So first workout here, 6 times 3 minute fartlek at 100% of CP. So again, I mentioned the Stryd Auto CP for me is 329 watts, 5.18 watts per kilogram. I'm just going to walk you through this workout and we'll talk about some of the extra stuff after the fartlek as well. So first rep was 327 watts, second rep was 332, then 337, 336, 326, 330. And let's talk a little bit about this and reflecting back to the 5K strategy. So this is going to be about a week after the first 5K time trial. The goal was to average right around 100% of my critical power. Again, I was running over rolling terrain with a little bit of wind. We can see specifically the elevation here, the gray line on the bottom, it does roll quite a bit, and I was able to maintain my power relatively well. I still had a couple spikes where reflecting afterwards, I was pretty unhappy with my lack of discipline and lack of ability to control and not really surge too hard over my critical power. The first 2 reps, I really wanted to make sure I didn't go above 335. I wanted to stick right around 330. And so I did a great job at that. The middle 2 reps, I was probably a little bit aggressive. And so I decided for the last 2 repeats to back it down a little bit. And that brought my average right around 330 watts for all 6 of the repeats averaged. So I ended up being really, really happy with it. A couple things that I wanted to work on was my ability to close very well at the end of a 5K. And so after this fartlek workout, I did 6 hill repeats, about 20 to 30-second hill repeats with a full recovery jog down. And then afterwards, some fast, flat strides, again, with a recovery period in between as well. So the kind of concept behind this one is to get about 18 minutes of running, so 6 times 3 minutes, and get that combined total close to critical power. Critical power in my case, I could probably sustain this if I looked at my auto-calculated critical power model curve. I could probably sustain this for somewhere between 35 to 45 minutes. It depends on my training and depends how the auto-calculated critical power model curve in stryd.com/power center is changing as my fitness evolves. So I consider this a win, but this is a good kind of basic workout to start to introduce a little bit longer duration at this critical power. Another thing I wanted to talk about, I talked about the basic training structure of including, threshold or that time-based interval, the fartleks, talking about doing some track work and a long run. Strides are very important. They actually have their own activity type. In the Stryd mobile app, you can tag your runs after you finish, and you'll be able to look at all your strides over time. So this was one that I just pulled up very quickly. When we're defining strides, people might call it something different, striders, whatever you kind of refer to. But typically, these are between 15 to 30 seconds with a 30-second to 1-minute jog recovery. It depends on what the, again, on portion is for the off and what the recovery is going to be. Typically in the training plan, at least for myself, I know for other people as well, they come the day before a workout. So it's to practice feeling good, running faster. The kind of keys here depends on you as a runner. So you can focus on what you specifically think you should work on. If you're a person that has a really high cadence or a really low cadence, you can work on changing that to see how your metrics might respond. You can work on being a little bit more powerful and running some uphill strides. You can do some flat strides, run strides on the track. It really depends on what you as an individual want to put into your training and see specifically what you should work on. But when I bring up strides, again, this is something that I do the day before every workout. So I'm doing these twice a week. And in my case, it's something as simple as, somewhere between 6 to 10 times 15 to 30 seconds fast with 30 seconds to a minute jog recovery. It doesn't have to be the most structured thing ever. It's just getting in a little bit of that more neuromuscular, or practicing the skill of running, practicing running fast. So if, again, the end goal is to work on closing a 5K very fast and with a good effort, I want to be able to work on that little piece of my training to maybe equate it to another sport. You might say, oh, if somebody is a basketball player, they don't necessarily just go and play basketball every single day. They work on free throws, you work on specific plays. So this could be almost in running it, you might equate it to a free throw. This is just practicing one specific skill set when it does come to running. Next one here is a long run, and we're based here in Boulder, Colorado, and we have a very, very fortunate setup where we can drive into the mountains, maybe about 45 minutes away, and be at about 2,500 meters to 3,000 meters above sea level, so about 8,000 to 9,000 feet. And so I like to do this about every other week. And here's an example of starting around 8,400 feet, going up to about 9,200 feet, and then coming back down. This is a pretty standard long run for me, and I'll talk a little bit more about the methodology and kind of idea behind using power in a long run like this as well. So we can see the first section, the first about 8 miles here is all uphill. It's a constant grade uphill, and we can see that I split it at right at the top, so about 8 miles in. I ran 56 minutes, 53 seconds for 8 miles going up. It's about an average pace of 708 per mile, but the power was 269 watts. And for me, that is getting close to the very edge of my easy zone right into my moderate zone, but the pace is a lot slower. My cadence was a little bit lower than I would like for a long run like this. 172 steps per minute, that's a little low. Form power was a little bit lower, and then my form power ratio in turn was a little bit lower as well, which is great. Coming back down, I still used power. I didn't want to necessarily make this too much of a moderate effort. I still ran almost 40 seconds per mile faster. So 6:31 pace coming down versus 7:08 pace going up. But using power, I actually averaged 8 watts lower coming back down the other side. So coming back down that same road, heart rate right about the same, cadence right about the same, form power ratio is a little bit higher, which is something that I know I can work on. My vertical oscillation was probably a little bit much coming back down. I was bounding a little bit too much. I wasn't taking as many steps, and so my form power ratio reflected that way. My ground contact time was a little bit higher. But this is some of the analysis that I look at. We'll compare the same route a couple of weeks later, and I'll show you a couple of things that I pick out and do find that I wanted to practice on. But this is a good example of just reviewing a long run, sitting down and kind of understanding why some of these numbers might be changing, especially if you run a very similar route all the time. I run this specific route maybe once a month, something like that. I like to switch it up if I do go up a little bit higher in altitude, but this is one of the mainstays, a run I really, really do like. Let's talk about track intervals now. So again, the goal was a 5K time trial, a couple of weeks of specific training, and then another 5K time trial. And both of these 5Ks were going to be on the track. So I wanted to practice running a little bit quicker, running a little bit more specific, and getting on the track feeling good. So this set of intervals is 4 by 1200. So 4 times 3 laps on a standard 400 meter outdoor track with a 1 lap jog recovery in between each. And then immediately after that, 4 times 800 with a lap jog in between, or 4 times 2 laps of a standard 400 meter track with a full lap jog in between. Goal here was to start right around critical power, work up a little bit higher than critical power, and then run the 800s a little bit closer to 5K effort. And so starting off with 330 watts, that's right at my critical power. It might be 100.5% to my critical power, 1 watt higher. And then 334 watts, 339, 341 was the progression for the first 4 1200s. So I did a great job, again, practicing starting a little bit conservative and then working up and having that base to kind of work off of. Same thing for the 800s, starting at 350 watts. The goal here in my mind was about 355, 354, about 106 to 107% of my critical power, which is exactly where I started. So I went 350 watts, 355, 356, 358. And so keeping in mind that I was going off of a little bit more aggressive of a power, a little bit more aggressive of a pace compared to the 5K that I ran about 2 weeks ago at this point. So the kind of progression here, again, is the thing I want to highlight, starting off a little bit conservative and then getting a little bit more aggressive and gradually progressing through. This is something that you can do no matter what, even if you're doing 400 meter repeats on the track, if you're aiming for time-based intervals out on the road, if you're doing a long run or a progression run, using power is one of those great ways to make sure you are progressing, no matter what the terrain is, no matter what the conditions are. And so this is a great example of starting very conservative, and then every single rep, you'll notice that I did improve and I did progress. And that is because I used power to pace, and it was a great way to make sure that I was continually improving throughout the workout. I'll take a quick check for questions here. Doesn't look like anything has popped in yet, but if anybody is watching right now, please feel free to send any questions our way. Getting back into it, the next workout was another track workout the next week, 3 times 1 mile plus 3 times 800. The first 3 times 1 mile repeats, again, starting very conservative, 318, which is about 96% of critical power. And then the next one in 329, which is 100% of critical power, exactly right on. And then 343 watts, which is 104% of critical power. I could not have written or executed this more perfectly. The goal was to start a couple percent below critical power, doing exactly that right at 96%, and then run the middle repeat at 100% of critical power. Literally ran exactly to the watt to 100% of critical power. And then the third repeat was supposed to be equally above critical power as the first one was underneath. And at 104% of critical power, that was equally above as I was underneath the first repeat. So a very progressive, again, progression here. I could have run it, all in one continuous bout. I could have done a 3-mile progression, but breaking it up 3 times 1 mile, make sure that I don't go out too hard. I don't run that middle portion too hard, and I don't close too hard and get a little bit too ahead of myself, because the rest of the workout was 3 times 800. And the goal here was to start right about where I left off on the 3rd mile repeat and then progress through the repeats. And so my last mile repeat was 343 watts, and then the first 800 was 345. So 2 watts above that, right in line, exactly what I wanted to do. The number 2 800 repeat was 350, so 5 watts above that, exactly right in line. And then the last one was a little bit more free reign, a little bit, of kind of like, okay, go for it, give it a little bit higher effort. And I averaged 372 watts there. So a little bit above the second 800 repeat, but exactly that progression that I've been talking about and kind of harping on this whole time. It was exactly in line of what I wanted to do. And in this case here too, I did some flat strides afterwards too. I did 4 times 200 meters with a 200-meter jog in between. Long run number 2. So this one is back down in Boulder, right at about 5,400 feet elevation above sea level, or 1645 meters above sea level. The goal for this one was to run decently moderate. We can see the time and zones breakdown here for this 17-mile long run. 24% in zone 1, that accounts for the kind of easy warm-up. For zone 2, 65% of the run was in zone 2, so exactly right in that moderate section. Zone 3, 9%, and zone 4, 2%. And this kind of accounts for some of the rolling hills on this course, where kind of keeping that moderate effort and not looking at that instant power might mean that I trip from that zone 2, that high zone 2, right into that low zone 3. Overall, though, the reflection that I have on this is that I practice that progression the exact same way as I would during an interval workout. I really try not to get above a power target or a certain limit in certain portions of the run, but there's a great job, great discipline, not just getting into it too quick. Really by the 3rd mile is when I'm right in that moderate range and moderate zone. And so, kind of adding some elevation gain in here too, about 300 meters of elevation or 974 feet of elevation gain during the run doesn't mean that this is necessarily a flat run. So it's a great job using power to kind of pace, even though looking back at it, I'm a little unhappy with some of my lack of discipline over some of these rolling hills, especially after the second half. There's a couple of these spikes that I will know not to do next time. So next one we're going to look at is a 7 times 3 minute fartlek starting at 100% of critical power and working progressively the whole time as well. So if you remember, the first workout we looked at was a 6 times 3 minute, where we were focusing on running at 100% of critical power for 18 minutes of total volume. For this workout, the goal is to get 21 minutes of volume. So again, 3 minutes more, start at around 100% of critical power and then work up and actually get a little bit above that, closer to current 5K effort if I had to run a 5K at altitude. So this again is going to be just harping on the main point that I was making. First repeat, 318 watts, that's 96% of critical power. Second repeat, 335, that's right above critical power. Third repeat, 327, again, within 2 watts of my actual critical power. And the last 4 reps, progressing, making sure that each rep I have a power target in mind based on the lap average from my previous rep, starting with 338 watts and then going 345, 350, and 359. And so progressing very evenly throughout the rest of the workout, but having that specific sort of goal in mind to progress as the workout goes on and really practice everything that I want to do on race day. I can absolutely use power to pace myself. And again, we'll highlight the specific stuff here. I did a couple of hill repeats and a couple of flat strides afterward as well. Let's go on to the next one here. So long run number 3, this is actually visiting a very similar long run location, but this one is a little bit more infamous, a little bit more hilly. This is Magnolia Road, even though I think it's technically called Magnolia Drive out here in Boulder, Colorado. It's pretty legendary because, as you can see, due to the the great elevation here in the background, it starts at about 8,200 feet, goes up to about 9,000 feet, and comes back down. It is pretty relentless in some of the steep climbs on the dirt roads out here. And so this is, again, a highlight of me not doing a great job pacing by power. You can see how spiky up and down the power actually is. And there's pretty good reflection, even though I wanted to make this a semi-moderate, semi-easy long run. My zone breakdown went zone 1, 55%. Zone 2, 27%. So about half of the time in zone 1, about a quarter of the time in zone 2. But I actually spent 15% of my time, specifically during these hill climbs, in zone 3, and then 3% in zone 4. So this actually contributed a lot of stress. For me, my normal long runs are around about 100 RSS, somewhere between 95 to 105. The running stress score here was 109. And for me, that's a pretty high number, specifically for about a 17-mile long run. And so highlighting, again, my failure, even though I work at Stryd and I talk all about training with power and Stryd, I still have things that I need to improve on. But the thing that I was probably most proud with was the end of the run, being able to finish at a pretty good effort, close to critical power, and still not, have burnt myself out during the preceding 16 miles. The last mile, I was able to pick it up a little bit, especially up the last kind of vicious and poorly timed uphill climb to finish the run out. So this was long run number 3. And then last workout example that I have here is a 5-mile progression tempo. So the progression was from 315 watts up to 350 watts. Starting off, again, wanted to make sure I started off below critical power. This was actually the week of the second 5K time trial. So I started at 313, again, right under that initial target of 315, at 95% of my critical power. Went 325 watts for the second mile split. That's 98% of my critical power. So you can see slowly stepping up. Mile 3 was 336 watts, which is 102%. Mile 4, 344, which is 104% of my critical power. And then lastly, mile 5, 353 watts, which is 107% of my critical power. And so I fondly remember this run. It was maybe a month ago now, a month and a half ago now, but this was a very fun use case for power. For each mile split, I was running with the Garmin 245. I had the Stryd zones data field, and I would have it split at the mile. And then whatever that lap average was, I wanted to average right around 8 to 10 watts higher than that for the next mile. And so after I saw 313 for the first mile split, I said, okay, goal is somewhere in the low to mid 320s. And then I averaged 325. Over the course of that mile, I got to, kind of ride that line, bump up right to 325, hold it there. Same thing for mile 3. I said, okay, I want to average, about 335, somewhere right around there. I averaged 336 because I was able to check my power in real time and make sure that effort was progressing. If you do look at the elevation graph on this one too, this one was a fairly rolling and hilly loop. I had about 300 feet of elevation gain and 300 feet of elevation loss. So this was about net positive or a net zero in terms of elevation gain and loss, about 100 meters of elevation gain during the whole 5-mile or 8-kilometer tempo effort. But I was able to specifically use Stryd to pace me on average to be in the exact power target. Again, for mile 4, 344 watts, which is 8 watts higher than the previous mile. And then for mile 5, 353 watts, which is 9 watts higher. And so if I could give any sort of use case for pacing by power, it would be this 5-mile progression tempo, hitting my splits exactly, not overexerting myself, knowing that whatever I have to do next, it's based on exactly what I did the mile before. I have a specific target in mind. But this was one of the most fun workouts that I did as well. So very, very fun memories, but a great use case on how to pace with power. All right, let's take a look at some of the questions that were sent in here. The first one is there an optimal running stress balance number between the negative and positive value for someone training for a marathon? Does this number change when focusing on the 5K distance? And this is a great question. It totally depends on your training, is what I would say. So to give a little bit of clarity around running stress balance, it's the difference between your average weighted value for your last 7 days of running for your running stress score versus that 42-day. So if you look at your 42-day, your 6-week versus your past week, it takes the difference in that. If you're more negative, it means that your last week has been a higher portion of stress compared to the average that you've been able to sustain. People might know this as an acute training load versus a chronic training load, fatigue versus fitness or form. There's all these different kind of performance management charts out there, but specifically for running stress balance, it's that difference. There isn't necessarily an optimal. The main thing is to look at trends and see which way you're trending. Typically, as we're heading closer to race day or time trial day, we would hope to have a little bit more positive running stress balance because we're not adding in as much fatigue as we're heading towards this goal effort. In terms of the number changing for the 5K versus the marathon, I think you might see more variable swings in running stress balance for the marathon due to the higher stress that a single activity might give. But on average, it should remain about the same. Typically for a marathon, you might have some longer tempo sessions that generate some more RSS, but then you see that equal recovery balancing out. Whereas the 5K, you have a little bit shorter overall duration for some of the workouts. So none of the workouts they did were really more than 6 miles in volume, but they were more intense. So it should end up being a pretty equal relationship. But for the marathon, you might see these more vicious swings with these really high RSS activities. Next question here is, if I am focusing on the 5K distance, how long should my maximum long run be on average? And I think that this is another it depends question. And so I can talk about myself. I'm a self-proclaimed marathoner. I've run a couple marathons, but I still really do like the 5K distance. If you look at my 5K PR versus my marathon PR, they actually line up very well. But I prefer marathon training and maybe prefer racing the 5K because the 5K, I feel like you can recover so much quicker than the marathon. But in terms of maximum long run, this totally depends on you. For somebody who's very experienced, been running for years and years and years, they might be used to running, 15 to 18 mile long run, no problem, and still be able to come back a couple days later and run a good track session. But for somebody who's a little bit newer and tackling the 5K as their first major race distance, then, their long run being about 4 miles, 5 miles, 6 miles, 10K, all the way up to 15K or 9 miles. That's totally reasonable. It totally depends on you as the individual. And that's definitely something that individuals should feel free to make sure, relates to them and they're not necessarily just looking at what other people are doing. Next question here. Thanks for all the great questions, by the way. If you are watching right now, or even after the fact, you're watching on our Facebook group or our YouTube channel, please feel free to leave any comments in the comment section. Next question is, if I primarily focus on the marathon distance, what are the benefits of me training for a 5K? One, I think mental relief is a really big key. Speaking from, my own vantage point, I really do enjoy the training variety for 5Ks. For marathon, it seems like a lot of people shy away from the track. A lot of people focus a lot on the long run, but the 5K is very fun. You can kind of switch up some of the intensity week over week, and you can really practice getting a lot faster, which is very fun. So, a mental relief or a sanity relief might be one thing. But overall, you could do a 5K cycle and actually end up improving your critical power, which in turn will benefit you down the road as you switch your gears to the marathon. So improving your overall level of fitness is a benefit that could potentially come from training for a 5K. Next question here is, you mentioned form power ratio. Could you please help clarify form power and form power ratio? It's my understanding that these metrics display wasted energy or energy used to maintain my form. So the lower energy used towards maintaining my form, the better. Correct. Typically, if we're going to look at form power and form power ratio, it is better to compare values or look at values over time when you're holding more variables equal. So this is a great question. To say that the metric is displaying wasted energy isn't necessarily like the perfect phrasing for that. I think that understanding where the power number comes from does help, and the form power comes from would absolutely help. But being able to take that metric with the understanding and then relate it to something that you're actually doing in practice is a great way to help understand that relationship too. So if I am doing a 5K and I'm running 15:45, if I'm running 20:45, if I'm running 25:45, and then I do another 5K a couple weeks later and I run 15:07, or I run 20:07, 25:07, and I look and I see that the form power is the same number between both those efforts, but that second effort had a higher overall power, that means that my form power ratio was actually a little bit lower, which means that extra power that I generated helped me move forward or move faster. And so when we look at some of these metrics, we should probably see that, maybe cadence went up a little bit. Maybe your vertical oscillation went down a little bit. Maybe your leg spring stiffness went up or down a little bit. Your ground contact time went up or down a little bit. So when we do look at metrics, specifically one like form power or in form power ratio, it is good to look at the other metrics as well and see what kind of trend that they're following too. So that's an absolutely great question. And then last question that I see here is, what watch or app do you use during your interval workouts? And this depends what the workout is. So if it is a track-based workout, I'm really just going to use the Garmin 245. I've used the Garmin 645. I might use Coros Pace 2, a watch that I have for the track stuff, because I'm running a set distance. If I'm going to go out and do a fartlek, or again, these time-based intervals, I'm going to use the Stryd app. I'm going to program in the workout there on my Garmin, and I'm going to, specifically have the watch tell me, okay, run at this target and run for this amount of time. And I think that that's a great experience. I also really do like our workout app on the Apple Watch. So I'm a big Apple Watch fan, and I do use that frequently as well. So that might be a luxury of being here at Stryd. We have to test a lot of things, and we have to make sure that the stuff works and we get all these different experiences. But specifically Garmin, Coros, we've used Polar, Suunto, Apple Watch. Those are all viable. But for me specifically in my normal rotation, it's Garmin 245 or Garmin 645. Recently the Coros Pace 2, now with the full Stryd functionality, and Apple Watch as well. So I do want to wrap up now. It looks like we don't have any other questions. If anybody is watching, does have any other questions after the fact, please, again, feel free to drop them in the comments. We'll be glad to answer them. Any suggestions for future webinar topics, we would be more than happy to take those as well. I do want to give a quick reminder here that you can go to stryd.com/guide, and you can view our brand new training guide that we are constantly adding to. Let us know what you'd like to see there as well. If you don't have Stryd, you can go to stryd.com and pick one up today. We are shipping now. And I think that wraps it up for the show. I want to thank everybody again for watching. My name is Evan. I'm really looking forward to being back next week with another great webinar. For now, happy running and enjoy the